Max chapter 3. His mother's sobs carried up and over the singing of the church choir. Justin could feel the whole pew shake as she cried. Her sadness was overwhelming, but Justin didn't feel sad. He didn't feel much of anything. Behind Justin and his parents, the pews were packed with friends and family that had known Kyle his entire life. Even his teachers and ex-girlfriends had come to pay their respects. Justin knew Kyle would find it hilarious to see all these people in one place, if it wasn't because of his funeral, of course. Justin tried to look anywhere but straight ahead at his brother's coffin. He gazed up at the arched ceiling for a minute, then down at the floor. He looked out the tall windows and counted the colors in the stained glass. He looked at the pastor's expression of concern. He wondered how long it had taken the man to perfect his funeral face. Justin watched the mouths of the singers, forming perfect O's, but his eyes were always led back to the casket in front of him. The casket was dark wood with gleaming handles and an American flag draped over the top. Next to it was a large photograph of a smiling Kyle posing in his uniform. Justin hated seeing the happy look on his brother's face. It only reminded him that he would never hear Kyle's laugh or see his big grin ever again. Justin had barely said goodbye to Kyle when he was getting ready to ship out. They had played some hoops in the driveway that morning. Kyle's bags were packed and his friends were going to drive him to the airport that afternoon. Kyle had told his parents they weren't allowed to take him. They all knew it would upset their mom too much. Justin shifted in his seat. The wooden bench was uncomfortable, as were his shoes and shirt and jacket. Every part of him felt unsettled and weird, inside and out. It was almost like he couldn't escape the ill-fitting clothes or the queasy feeling in his gut or the ache that had settled in his chest since the day the two Marines had showed up at his front door. If Justin was being honest with himself, he had been angry at Kyle the day he had shipped out. He didn't understand why his older brother had to leave their family, had to leave him. With Kyle gone, there would be no one else for their dad to focus on. Just Justin, who could never do anything right. Justin, who wanted to play video games all day. Justin, who didn't want to join the Marines. And now that Kyle was never coming back, their dad would only start paying more attention to Justin, and their mom would only be more worried about him all the time. The choir continued their hymn. The notes echoed up to the ceiling, and Justin let the music fill his mind and clear away all his thoughts. Suddenly, the wide double doors of the church flew open with a bang and interrupted the song. The old wooden seats creaked loudly as everyone in the room spun around to look at the late arrivals. Justin strained his neck to try to see the group of men silhouetted against the doorway. There were 4 of them, and they were all in military dress uniforms. One of the soldiers held a leash, at the end of which was a very familiar-looking black and tan dog. Though he'd never actually met the animal, Justin instantly recognized his long black snout and oversized pointy black ears from the many video chats with his brother. It was Max. He was bigger and slinkier than he appeared on camera, lean but with muscles rippling under his fur. What was he doing here? Why wasn't he still in Afghanistan and teamed up with a new soldier? Max stood in the doorway and sniffed the air. His head bobbed up and down as he strained against his collar. He took a few steps inside and sniffed at the ground. Justin thought he looked nervous, or maybe confused. Suddenly, Max froze. His body tensed up and his eyes grew round. Justin could tell he had found a familiar scent. Max bolted forward, but the man holding his leash tightened his grip and yanked back. He said a command to Max that Justin couldn't quite hear. Max just kept struggling against his leash, his 2 front paws coming off the ground. One of the men in uniform walked up the aisle to Justin and his parents. I'm sorry we're late, Mr. and Mrs. Wincott," he said, leaning over the pew. "We had a little tussle with Max here." Justin couldn't believe it, but his mom actually smiled. There was a flash of happiness in her red-rimmed eyes. She looked at Max, then back up at the man. "It's quite all right," she said. "I'm Sergeant Reyes," the man went on. He had buzzed black hair and smiling eyes. "I trained your son and Max. After the incident, they sent Max back to us for an evaluation. He's been having a hard time since he got back. We thought since we're located nearby, it might be a good thing for Max to be here today." "You thought right," Justin's mom replied. "Kyle would have wanted it this way, I'm sure." Across the room, Max whimpered and perked up his ears as if he had heard Kyle's name. Sergeant Reyes nodded at the man holding Max's leash, or trying to hold Max's leash. Mostly the man was getting dragged around by Max, who was using all of his well-trained brute strength to pull forward. Justin winced at the sight of the dog's desperate eyes and the sound of his whimpering. Max panted and strained to breathe as the soldiers struggled to restrain him. But Max was stronger and more determined. The dog yanked so hard Justin was actually worried for the man's arm. With a jolt, the leash flew out of his hand. Max shot forward and crossed the room at lightning speed, stopping in front of Kyle's casket. He raised himself up on his hind legs and rested his front paws on top of the wood. He sniffed at the shiny handles, the flowers, and the flag. Everyone in the church held their breath and watched. Finally, Max touched his nose to the flag atop Kyle's coffin and let out a mournful howl. Then, as if he'd confirmed something for himself, Max dropped onto the floor, spun in a circle, curled up in a ball, and lay down at the foot of the casket. The crowd gasped, then loud sobs rang out across the room. Justin's mom gripped his dad's hand tightly and began to weep again. Justin saw his dad's lower lip begin to quiver. His dad nodded quickly at the pastor, who gestured to the choir. The first notes of a new hymn floated out over the crowd as Max howled along. As the ceremony came to an end, Justin dreaded the next step. They had to go to the cemetery to bury Kyle. But first, Sergeant Reyes and his men had to get Max away from the coffin, which was basically impossible. Like Justin, Max didn't want to go. Reyes used a hand signal and a verbal command, but Max ignored him. Then the handler pulled hard on Max's leash, and the dog went berserk. Everyone jumped as Max let out a series of harsh barks and howls. Justin didn't remember Max ever acting this crazy. Kyle always said he was the perfect dog. Max strained against his leash, snarling and thrashing his head around, and he scratched at the floor. It was terrible to watch. Justin had never seen an animal so upset before. In a way, though, Max was just doing what Justin wished he could do. Scream and yell and let everyone know how mad he was at this whole stupid situation. Sergeant Reyes turned to Justin's parents with a sheepish look on his face. "I'm sorry," the sergeant said. "Max really was trained better than this." "It's okay," Justin's mom said softly. "I understand how he feels." The handler slowly managed to steer Max away from the casket, even as the dog continued to growl and bark. But just as they neared the front pew where Justin and his parents stood watching, Max suddenly froze and locked his legs. He raised his black muzzle into the air and twitched his nose. He'd caught the scent of something, and it instantly calmed him down. Max sniffed at the air and took a step toward Justin's mom and dad. Sergeant Reyes instantly jumped in front of Max, shielding them from the unpredictable dog. "It's okay," Justin's mom said. "I think he smells something. I think he recognizes us." Reyes gave her a skeptical look, but moved slightly to the side, allowing Max to take another step forward. He sniffed at her legs, then at Justin's dad. Everyone in the church watched anxiously. Finally, Max nosed his way between the windcots and sat down right at Justin's feet. Nervously, Justin took a big step backward, putting a safe distance between him and Max. He could feel the eyes of everyone directed straight at him. Even the pastor watched from the altar. "And who might you be, son?" Reyes asked. "This is Kyle's brother," Justin's mom replied. "Justin." Justin's dad looked ready to pounce on the dog if he'd try to hurt his wife or son. Max leaned forward and took a curious sniff at Justin. His long tail gave the slightest hint of a wag. Justin gulped and felt his hands get a bit sweaty. He'd never been a dog person like Kyle. The last time he'd been anywhere near a dog was the 20 chihuahuas that lived at Chewy's house, and those tiny furballs don't count. "Max seemed to have figured out who you are," Reyes said to Justin, his voice warm and measured. The sergeant gave Justin a once-over, as if he were assessing a military situation. "Want to help us get him to the van?" Justin shook his head. "No, thanks." Reyes held Justin's gaze for a long moment. Justin felt as if the man was trying to read his mind, so he looked away and down at the ground. "Might go a lot easier if you did," Sergeant Reyes said, gesturing to the church doors and the parking lot behind them with his thumb. "Go on, Justin," his dad said, his voice hoarse. "Help the men out." Justin shrugged. He hated that everyone was staring at him. Now he wasn't just Kyle's little brother or even the dead Marine's little brother. He was the dead Marine's little brother who got sniffed by a crazy dog in church. Lufkin was too small of a town for news to stay quiet for that long. Okay, fine, he muttered. Justin headed for the doors. Max trotted happily by his side. The handler gave Max some slack on his leash, and Max didn't pull away. Justin kept waiting for Max to turn psycho again, but he didn't. The group stepped out into the sunlight and heat, and Max stuck next to Justin as they crossed the parking lot to the van. It was like Max was on a mission. Justin wondered if this is what Max did when he and Kyle were on patrol. Max was alert, and his big black and tan ears swerved from side to side, listening for danger. Justin almost wanted to laugh. What kind of danger did this dog expect to find in a tiny, boring Texas town? Rays opened the back doors, revealing a large metal box with one small window near the top. Max instantly lowered his front half to the ground and growled. All the fur on the back of his body stood on end. He barked at the crate as if it were his worst enemy. Sergeant Rays sighed and grabbed a leather muzzle. All right, he said, facing his men. Let's do this. Everybody ready? The soldiers nodded, although Justin thought they looked anything but ready. Instead, it looked like they were dreading getting Max into the crate. On my count, Rays said. 1, 2, 3. 3 men circled Max from behind as Rays approached from the front, the muzzle in his hand. Max backed up, but couldn't get past the half circle of muscle behind him. His handler held the leash tight. Rays stepped forward and in one quick motion buckled the mesh leather cone over Max's nose. The dog yelped and swung his head from side to side. His whole body shook and his tail dropped between his legs. Justin watched the scene with a heavy heart. Max hadn't done anything wrong, but he still had to be controlled. Once he was muzzled, Max began scratching fiercely at the ground and trying to knock the cone off his face with his front paws. Do you still need my help? Justin asked. He didn't really want to put Max through any more pain. We still need to get him in the van, Race said. Maybe you can just talk to him while we do it. Okay, what should I say? Anything you think he might want to hear, Race said. Justin swallowed hard. Now that the dog wasn't able to bite, the Marines closed in. Someone counted to 3. Each man grabbed Max and they lifted him up into the crate. Max fought with all his might. He couldn't get out any real barks, but he growled loud. He butted the men with his head, whipped them with his tail, and scratched at them with his giant paws. He landed a few good blows to a couple of their chests and a raised cheek. The men grunted and struggled and eventually backed Max into the crate. Rays closed the metal gate as quickly as possible. It seemed so extreme to lock up a dog like that. But at the same time, Justin didn't know how else they would manage Max. He was a mad dog, that was for sure. Justin realized he hadn't said a word the entire time. Oops. Oh, sorry, I didn't talk to him. Rays brushed his messed up hair back from his face and straightened his rumpled shirt. The other men rearranged their uniforms as well. It's okay, Rays said. That was actually Max on his best behavior. I think having you here calmed him down a bit. Seriously, that was calm? Justin asked, astonished. Rays smiled and raised an eyebrow in acknowledgement. Thanks, Justin. He held out his hand and Justin shook it. Your brother talked about you a lot, you know. Justin felt a dull throbbing in his chest. He hadn't known that. He always felt as though Kyle left and just stopped thinking about him, stopped being his brother. Hearing otherwise nearly knocked the breath out of him. Rays gave him a quick salute and climbed into the driver's seat of the van. Max's handler checked the lock on the crate and started to close the back doors. Wait! Justin called out. He took a step forward. Max paced and spun in a slow circle inside his crate. His tail hung low between his back legs. He looked miserable. Bye, Max, Justin said softly. Max looked up at him, and Justin was surprised to feel a surge of sadness. He had never met this dog before. Why did he care about what happened to him? Would you look at that, Justin's mom said. He likes your voice, Justin. Justin swallowed hard against the knot in his throat and told himself to get it together. He stood with his parents, and they all watched as Max dropped to the ground and put his head down on his front paws as if all the fight was gone out of him. And for the moment anyway, Max's handler closed the doors gently but firmly and climbed into the passenger's seat. The van pulled away, and Max was gone. That's the end of chapter 3.